Ricky, thank you so much for joining. We were just chatting off camera there, and I was saying how much your show, how much value I've got from your show already. An incredible daily commitment from you. But I just think it's so important and so refreshing actually to see a new voice within this, within the Bitcoin space, but also talking about broader subjects. Obviously, your daily show focuses on, quite specific themes. You've got these four pillars that you speak to your audience about. But before we kind of get into that, I'm just so interested in kind of your background. I know obviously you were a very successful travel creator prior to your new show, and had a very successful travel business as well. I guess kind of like what has spurred this kind of new journey that you're going on? From the outside looking in, it kind of really feels like a kind of like an enlightenment process that you've kind of been through. And, as a viewer, it's so nice to see that on the other side. But kind of what spurred you to kind of go on this journey?
Well, first, thanks, Lewis, for having me. It's an honor to be among the first guests here on Orientation, and thanks for the kind words about the show itself. Age of Abundance was just an idea I had, and all of these, even the four pillars of the show, we'll call it money, intelligence, energy, humanity, was like an idea I had, and I crafted, and it's cool to see that echoed back at me for sure. So it's a pleasure to be here chatting with you today. I guess you could call it an enlightenment process of the not necessarily religious kind, but in fact, a very material kind, right? In fact, it was purely, for me, an enlightenment process along the lines of observing what to most people are hidden or invisible forces that shape the world. And for me, in my first chapter, traveling the world, I think during the whole time, there was a undercurrent of, if I'm going to rack up all these experiences, which is what I've been told to desire as a millennial, right? We all have this like experiences more than things mentality that we've grown up with. But if I'm going to do this, what I'm going to use it for down the line? I've always had that undercurrent, right? And yes, if people followed me during that chapter, they may not have seen that, but they may have detected it. I had some, I had a, it all started with a blog, like my own personal travel reflections. And those were always some of the moments along the journeys that I enjoyed the most. It was like actually sitting down and put it into words, and the process of doing so, and the process of telling a personal story and my personal perspectives from it, right? But obviously, as the business grew, there became some of the more commercial side, some of the YouTube, some more flashier side, and then I got kind of sucked in by the algorithm to some extent, and I spent a lot of time like on airplanes and making videos and all that. So those kind of took the spotlight towards the later years of my Prince of Travel days. But I think that undercurrent was always there, and it was always gnawing at me, especially as I became more and more, felt a greater sense of disillusionment between continuing to pursue the travel game, even as I hedonically adapted, right? Even as I just did it more and more and more, because that was my role, because that was my role as like founder CEO of the company, and my role as you could call it, I was being founder CEO and an influencer at the same time, right? People were looking at me watching these videos, and I was getting a lot of attention for continuing to travel even when it was no longer the genuine thing. So I felt that disillusionment, right? That disconnect between what I was doing with my time, and along the way, along these travels, all of the problems I observed that needed solving in the world that did not seem to be on a track to being solved, like at all. And so that created a sense of, all right, there's got to be something deeper here. There's got to be some way that I can use what I've observed and experienced to, actually contribute to solving these problems in the next chapter. But what is that? What was that thing? And it took a time of pure stillness and separation from my old self. And I basically told my team at the company, hey, you guys run it. I need to take a break because I've been grinding for like 8 years straight. Right out of university, this is what I did. I needed to take a break and be still and have space in my life for the first time, and then see like where my organic curiosities led. And it was there that, this whole time I've been loosely aware of Bitcoin as a phenomenon, but never really understood it, never truly appreciated it beyond the surface level narratives. And it was during this period that I had the opportunity to say, okay, there's been a whole bunch of stuff that's happened in Bitcoin, it seems. There's been block size wars, there's been, different software now, different clients, different people to follow and listen to, books, podcasts. Let me dive in and make sense of it for myself.
It's funny that you kind of obviously speak about you kind of needed that stillness. When I first started watching the show, I hadn't quite realised, obviously, how, you built such a big presence on YouTube for your travel content. And I went back and I was watching some of your old videos, and there was the 10 lessons turning 30. And I thought really interesting that, I think it was either the second or the third point, but it was around conviction. And obviously, in terms of what you're doing now, I guess, some of those kind of like early signs that obviously, are you more on a human level? Would you kind of say that you kind of saw glimpses of obviously what you've become and what you're doing now, even when what you were doing before?
Yeah, 100%. The way that we make sense of our lives is always retrospectively, right? We always live the life, experience things, and then think back along our experiences and make sense of it. And so I'm no different. And the way I retrospectively look at the story now is, what makes sense to me is the travel was always about abundance in the first place. The travel was always about seeking truth, seeking a greater range of perspectives in order to be able to assemble like a higher fidelity picture of the truth, of how humans live, of what are the possibilities for us, than necessarily what I would have gotten from just sticking to a narrow, safe path, right? Staying in one place or staying with a safe career, and so on and so forth. And so, and the other thread there is, during the travel times, for me, it was not just hey, go take a trip, but it was also, hey, how can you take a trip for a fraction of the cost? And my audience was largely Canadian and North American, and we had these, we have loyalty programs and credit cards, and Prince of Travel, the brand, my first company, grew out of becoming an expert on how to leverage these, at the end of the day, these are highly fiat elements, but they represented the opportunity at that time to maximize one's travels. And through doing that work, I was able to deliver to significant numbers of people an experience that transformed them, right? The ability to fly first class when they never would have dreamed of being able to do so. And so that narrow form of abundance was like, you could say, my training wheels at the time for this current phase, right? Which is a much broader task, much more work to be done. But Bitcoin adoption to me represents abundance for all. And it emerges from our actions. And when I really understood that, then I thought, I had the thought of, well, I've already had one chapter of taking a contrarian position and helping educate people, helping people see what they couldn't see and enroll into a new belief and then take action. And that fundamental muscle is no different. And so as I was thinking about what action I could take to enable this transition and to help others experience it easier than I did, right? Because I had to create space for myself. I spent a whole year going through, and I'm sure for you at this stage, it was similar. There's a lot of hard work that has to be done. First principles thinking and attacking your own beliefs that has to take place, right? But how can I, through my actions, make that journey, make that process smoother for others? Did a lot of thinking on that. And, my starting point is Age of Abundance, the show.
One of the concepts that you've spoken about on the show is this idea of kind of activation thresholds, and I wondered whether you could kind of explain that in a bit more detail, and I guess in terms of your own journey, kind of what that activation threshold kind of looked like for you. Was there a kind of a single kind of aha moment, or I guess from the sounds of it, it was the result of, obviously a long period of kind of hard work.
For sure. I did an episode a couple of weeks back around the idea of activation thresholds. And just for context for people who may be tuning in, I build these episodes from my own thinking process, right? And uh, what I do to try to flesh out these ideas is I work with my AI partner and I go down these different tangents and rabbit holes, flesh out some of these ideas, and then it just becomes part of my corpus. So then when I want to do episodes, I tell it, hey, give me a run of show for, let's talk about game theory, or let's talk about activation thresholds, and so on and so forth. So the activation thresholds is interesting to me because now that I'm in the space, I spend a lot of time thinking about exactly how hyper Bitcoinization will happen, right? How the Bitcoin transition takes place. And very upfront, this is unknowable. It's just a nature of the way my mind works. I think the way a lot of our minds work is like we want to know, even if it's unknowable. So we want to spend time thinking about the concepts that may underpin a transition, right? And for me, I like the idea of we have 8 billion people, and it's a journey that 8 billion people are going to go through. And every person has their own different activation threshold, right? For what needs to be true that they can observe before they're going to start taking action, before they can enroll into a new belief. Because fundamentally, we're undergoing a major shift in collective beliefs. And we have undergone these shifts as humanity. And it's interesting that we live in a time where we're alive to be part of it. But during this time, there's no sugarcoating the fact that it's an uncomfortable process to live through a major paradigm shift in terms of belief and in terms of belief around something as important as money. And so activation thresholds for me, yeah, it's like people, 8 billion of us, who's going to move first? The people that need the least physical evidence in the world, right? The people who from reasoning and conviction alone, even if most people haven't moved, are able to move. And everybody has their threshold where some people might need a few more people than now to move. But, that's why those of us who are ready to move now and take action now, that's why it's important that we do so. So that's the idea. And for me, just to think back to those times, figure out if it was true, analyze it through my own experiences and lenses, and then decide what action to take.
Yeah, the reason I ask is because obviously I know once you left the business, as you described earlier on, obviously you had kind of this period of, I guess, self-reflection, really. And in terms of these activation thresholds, I'm just trying to kind of think in my own head how it works for other people. I think of, I take my dad, for instance, worked at Jaguar Land Rover in a factory all of his life, worked 3 shifts, days, afternoons, nights, nights, slept in the daytime, got up, ate his dinner, went to work. He had no time to think, deeply really about, some of the questions that, we just kind of posed, and let alone, I guess, come to any of the answers. How much of that is kind of a natural inclination in terms of general curiosity, or an inclination to follow that conviction no matter what, compared to having the time and I guess the privilege really to have that period of self-reflection and do the work. Have you got any views on that?
I think those two are fairly correlated. I think if you've got the predisposition to question your surroundings and have a high filter for what's true and what's arbitrary, then you're likely to have created you're likely to have taken agency within even the legacy fiat world, right? I think there's correlation there. And so then it's just a matter of I think it goes back to me to that, there's agency and then there's disagreeableness, right? Which are kind of orthogonal. Like a lot of people have high agency, but then become very, very effective at operating within fiat. And if they are low disagreeable in that they don't want to rock the boat, they don't necessarily, want to go against the collective, then they may just stay, until the very, very late stage, until everybody moves in a given transition, right? Any transition. So I think it's kind of those two axes. How willing are you to go against the grain if you have conviction in what you believe is right? Those are the Michael Burrys, the people who've moved early, right? And the people moving early now in Bitcoin, I think, follow a similar profile.
Going back to your show and, turning up daily and trying to reach new audiences and obviously have a fresh voice, you carried over probably, no doubt, people that followed you when you were a travel creator, to have the opportunity to reach some of those people that perhaps didn't have the time or had perhaps never even, probably knew that something was wrong or something felt off, but never really had the guidance or the opportunity to build the understanding of actually what that, kind of potentially what that problem is. And I know you speak, very eloquently about obviously the fact that we are living under a debt-based, kind of fiat monetary system. And I think one of the problems within Bitcoin is so many, and I guess people that talk about macro more broadly, is there's so much jargon, so much technical understanding. I guess, it'd be really, great to hear, just what is your simple view when it comes to, kind of what is the current system that we're living in. And I guess in terms of, normal people and their daily lives, potentially why is, that, a potential problem?
Yeah, for sure. This is something I thought very deeply about as I launched the show, because most of the messaging I was hearing out there, to your point, felt incomplete to me, right? Because the Bitcoin conversation is often dressed up in terms of its opposition to fiat, but I don't think fiat even tells the whole story, right? To me, fiat is a natural end state of a longer problem, which is when you start to use money as debt and when you need to continually expand upon that debt. And then, to your point, fiat obviously needs to, in order to sustain itself and sustain its own perceived legitimacy, it needs the jargon. It needs the layer that basically, by default, excludes most people from feeling like they have permission to understand. And then you have a bunch of Bitcoin conversations that buy into that, right? That play the game on fiat's terms by thinking that all the jargon matters, when in fact, the debt can't be repaid on real terms. And the only way it can be repaid on nominal terms is for us to keep kicking the can down the road. It is that simple, right? When you start off lending $10 into existence, $11 is owed, $10 with interest, but that $1 doesn't exist. When you kick off this kind of system, all the way back in like 1694, around the time of the Dutch and the Bank of England, right? William of Orange, and I've told that story in the show too. But when you start off like that, and that $1 doesn't exist, the only way is to create more money. Fundamentally, then you're going to have like fiat macroeconomists telling me that's an oversimplification, because the whole thing has gotten so complex that the complexity is needed, right? But fundamentally, when that happens, there's not enough money to repay the debt to keep everything solvent. You got to keep expanding the debt, which becomes the money supply eventually. I like the way Joe Bryan puts it. There's a big red button. Somebody has the privilege to press it and create new money under the guise of managing the economy. Now, then for me, the question was, well, why do we have this system, right? Like, are the kings and queens of old the problem? And for me, the answer is no, because the system was necessary to scale beyond gold, right? The debt-based money, the gold-backed paper, was necessary for us to build in velocity of transactions to scale as humanity. And to me, that's the complete story. When I talk to people who are new to the topic, the temptation is for there to be something to blame, right? Somebody's fault. But in fact, this is a journey that we are all on as 8 billion people, even the people at the top of the power structures now. And I'm trying to be very clear about that, right? Like, people are optimizing locally, and most people don't have an awareness of what we're talking about. And human beings can live entire lives just being, conditioned by local incentives. And that's just how we operate. And so for me, it's all about awareness, and bringing everything into the light, and directing attention at what is the right system that we need to focus on, which is, yes, right now it's fiat, but when you had gold-backed paper and the paper had to expand, eventually you had to sever the link, right? Because you could change the rules around gold ownership, but eventually, you get to a point where you're going to keep having these booms and bust cycles and expansions and runs against the bank because you've expanded the debt and the money supply, where eventually the natural end state is you sever any linkage to the natural world. And so to me, that whole 300 plus year old system is the most interesting story that we're graduating out of, right? And it's not a battle between Bitcoin and fiat necessarily. It's more of a maturation process for humanity. That's my take. And usually people haven't heard it in those terms. And I find that for most people, it resonates more to understand the problems first. And then usually I get people asking, like, isn't this actually a really terrible state? Then it's instructive to bring in, that's why you have to understand Bitcoin, and here's how it works.
You mentioned bringing it into the light. It really does feel like that. Certainly if you look at the last 6 years, obviously what happened, during the pandemic, the trillions that were created, a lot of which, kind of went to waste, or as you say, has only served to, I know you speak about the Cantillon effect, has only served to make, those with capital and those with assets even richer. And I think actually going back to one of the points that you raised before, that's what I've taken, and I think is a really important reminder, is that this isn't a blame game. And actually, we can look at, for example, politicians or big business, corporate, and it's so easy to point the finger and say, actually, this is, you're the reason why this has happened. But I think you're completely right. That's why it's so important to, you mentioned, 300 years. Actually, this has been going on, significantly longer. I'm reading, an incredible, I'd really recommend it actually if you've never read it before. It's called The Great Wave, by David Fisher, and it talks about how there's been several, massive price fluctuations during time, even dating back to the 1100s, kind of medieval times. And actually what we're seeing now is the consequence of, the Great Wave is the consequence of how many times this has kind of happened before. And that actually brings me quite nicely to my next question is, you speak about the current system that we're in, the fact that, the US debt, 40 trillion, it will never be repaid. And I think we're all seeing the signs of, the system is fraying round the edges. You are kind of seeing the instability, globally, really. One of the great things from the book actually is talking about how one of the, kind of physical metaphors for the debt-based system is architecture, in terms of, some of the incredible buildings, the buildings that were built during the Renaissance period, a period of kind of equilibrium when it comes to money supply and inflation, kind of allowed for these incredible buildings to be built that have lasted hundreds, thousands of years. I guess when we talk about, the kind of a fraying of the system, kind of what are the visible signs in your mind that actually, the system is under pressure, that things are breaking?
Yeah, I think there's so many different ways to take this, right? And so many different signs that any individual observer will care about their own subset of issues and pressing problems that matter to them. But pretty much all of them, for any given listener, can be traced to the inflation that happens, the expansion of the money supply, the unrepayable debt, the nature of the monetary system, and the incentives baked into it. Essentially, what's happening is, most contracts in the world are established on the basis of these fiat currencies, the US dollar, the Great British Pound Sterling, Canadian dollar, and so on. Built into these currencies itself is a function of intermediary, a function of, you can call it theft, right? A reduction in value, a silent leakage, invisible leakage in value. That's essentially what's happening. It's coming within every voluntary transaction that we think is neutral and it's not neutral. And that goes downstream to everything we observe in the world today. And so, to me, the interesting part of the journey and the task at hand is helping people see these linkages to any given issue, right? And I'll just throw out a few examples. Like in all of our cities, you've got signs of silent decay. You've got growing homelessness. You've got trash piling up on the street. You've got and then what you have is like we don't see the counterfactual, right? We just see the current state, and we don't see what the cities could look like if we did in fact have sound money, if we did in fact have incentives that pointed in the direction of low time preference and a longer time horizon. And so what we do see is just cities becoming, like you said, buildings looking like boxes, and essentially everything becoming a factory of sorts, right? Everything that could potentially have elegance and beauty and individualism instead becoming a factory-run process. I'll also share one example from, let me wrap up the city example, because not just my city in Vancouver, right? Downtown is not a nice place. It's not a place that I would feel comfortable, having my kid go by himself. And that's a shame, because 20, 30 years ago it was, and it was a vibrant, beautiful, full of hope. Other people in Vancouver feel the same way. And it's like, how do we collectively solve this problem? There's only one solution, is to fix the money. It's not just Vancouver, possibly your city, right? Over in the UK, I was recently there, big Arsenal fan. So I was there for the parade in the summer of 2026. And I, as somebody who understands the dynamics of debt-based money versus emerging Bitcoin, I couldn't help but feel sad that the area around North London, right, the stadium that I, feel a sense of belonging to and love to visit over the years, was essentially in a state of disrepair. Essentially, it was in the same state with less repair compared to when I was there 10 years ago. And that was sad. People obviously still made the most of it, but people can't observe what they can't observe, right? People can't observe that. And, I'm sure this is pressing around the UK from what I can tell, right? That living standards and cost of living crises are mounting. Why, right? People haven't yet, there is not yet mass awareness of the reasons why, but that's what we're working on. So look, cities is one. I'll give you an example from my past life, and, potentially, I'm not involved with my travel side right now, but we can maybe talk about what future plans may look like. But even if you look at the travel space, genuine hospitality in, whether it's the budget end or the higher end is giving way to financialization of real estate and selling residences to billionaires that are close to the money printer, right? And so that's what travel and hospitality is becoming about, where the returns are going, and what the whole industry is shaping around. Hey, this is normal, right? Because most participants just think yeah, this is the way it goes. It is a K-shaped economy, so that's how we have to adjust. So anyway, that's a more specific, narrow niche example, right? But the point is, you can observe this everywhere in life. Doesn't matter if it's broad-based, doesn't matter if it's your specific industry. Pay attention, right? So is the money neutral, right? Are the things we're saying on this podcast true about the dollar and the other fiat currencies? And then how it shapes the world we live in right now. And then how emergent Bitcoin, right, as it emerges from our actions and as adoption increases, could provide the complete opposite pathway into the future.
The quality of the food, quality of buildings, quality of customer service. And I mean, I'd never thought of that before, but I guess, the quality of our football stadiums. I guess the Emirates is probably in, I mean, you say somewhat disrepair, but, Old Trafford, leaking roofs. I guess everywhere that you look around you is the physical manifestation of the degradation of quality. And as you so eloquently put, that comes down to the fact that fundamentally the money is broken. And I think you can't ignore it now. And leading into my next question, and obviously you spoke about it, but obviously, rather than blaming, looking at the solution, and obviously in your mind, I guess, in my mind as well, you see Bitcoin as the solution. I guess it'd be, great to understand and I guess share with, the potential listener about, kind of why that is.
Yeah, let's get into it. And obviously, for us to have gotten to this point, we've had to reason our way through exactly why that is and why it can't be anything else, right? And so for me, the first thing to say is like there's about 15 different ways that we could approach the topic of explaining Bitcoin. For me, I start with like, I guess where my mind goes to start on this is like directing people to the fact that people long before us understood the nature of this problem. People long before us understood that we have this collective belief in something that in a local time period we use as money. And if that form of money is being manipulated in a way that is imperceptible to most people, then there will always be these cycles, right, of mounting essentially dishonesty built into the system because some of the money kept getting siphoned away. That would result in widespread grotesque inequality until it got to a point where people either rise up or are risen up against. And then there'd be cycles of destruction of human capital, whether it's war or revolution. And then we start again because the money was still, in a state of being vulnerable to manipulation. Essentially, if you had to trust somebody to manage the giant Excel sheet of who had what, they prove time and time again that they're going to manipulate it to their own ends. And so people long before us understood this. And during the 70s, 80s, 90s, as the internet was emerging, these people, which were a group called the cypherpunks, understood that there had to be work being done to work on solutions for a digitally native, neutral form of money that could solve this species-old problem. Okay? And these were the cypherpunks, and there were repeated attempts at solutions until you got to a point where somebody or a group of people called Satoshi Nakamoto in 2009 launched Bitcoin. And it has been 17 years or so of Bitcoin's existence. And the very nature of its launch, which was anonymous into the wild, right? Adoption by interested parties, a bottoms-up phenomenon rather than top-down, which is different than pretty much anything we observe in the world today. It had to be that way because the centralized control over the existing form of money was so strong. And so why does Bitcoin come into this picture of debt-based money and pose as the solution? Well, essentially what it's done is it's taken the best parts of the debt-based money system, the best parts of fiat, which is the velocity of money, right? The ability to transact and settle money globally around the world over the internet. And it's also combined that with the highest qualities of what we had before that, which was gold, the ability to store value, the inability for anybody to manipulate the form of money, right? Nobody can change the qualities of gold. Nobody can arbitrarily print more gold because it takes work, it takes real world energy to mine gold out of the earth. And it took those qualities of gold through very elegant cryptographic and computational methods, combined it into essentially what is a shared ledger native to the internet that is distributed around computers around the world. And so depending on who I'm speaking to, right, sometimes I'll draw the parallel of it's like BitTorrent. People in our age group, we've experienced what it's like to like download small pieces of a file from strangers on the internet in a way that can't be stopped, right? So, for a more millennial person I'm speaking to, I might use that analogy. But there's different ways to understand it, right? But the whole point is there's elegance in its design. Its initial design provided that secure foundation because it was both secure, but for the first time in history, secure in a decentralized way, secure in a way where you didn't have to trust a central actor or committee. Instead, it was maintained by people who understood it and understood its importance. And it was anchored by those people such that as more people adopted, those people started to understand and participate too. And the price action that we've seen in Bitcoin is a reflection of humanity starting to discover what how valuable this could be, right? Nothing has outperformed it. And if you don't go to the depth, most people haven't gone to the depth of understanding exactly why the price action is so powerful. But if you don't go to the depth of understanding it, then it'll always be an itch that needs to be scratched for why has this thing that has outperformed everything else? And the answer is, it is the most powerful form of money that is on track to solving the many problems that a debt-based monetary system, by its very nature, as you play out over time, introduces. Again, at the start, that system, relative to where we were then, right, had a use case and provided real value. And now, through nobody's fault, just through the passage of time, and how it silently shapes incentives, the debt-based monetary system is consuming itself. Bitcoin represents a credible solution, a solution that, through first principles reasoning, current adopters can verify for themselves that if they adopt, they're likely to have a positive expected value from whether it's purchasing power or just through a state of being, from understanding the transition we're going through, and from adopting and from seeing that their own actions matter, right? And from seeing that their own actions contribute to solving these widespread problems for themselves and their next generations. I really think that is a very, very powerful drive. I'll pause there. Maybe you have different viewpoints on Bitcoin and how to explain it, because the interesting thing is, over any 5-minute period, I can only possibly do justice to one of the possible lenses. For me, that's also why the Daily Show is interesting, because there's all these different viewpoints to jump to.
I guess Bitcoin compared to other forms of money, fiat currencies, the pound in your pocket, the dollar in your pocket, is the fact that it is neutral. There's no single party that has ownership over the system. There's no one person that controls, kind of who can buy it, who can sell it, who can transfer it. I wondered whether, Ricky, that you could just go into a little bit more detail about how, as a result of that, people forget that, the real superpower is that it is collective ownership. There is no single point of failure, no single person that is able to control it. Are you able to, I guess, just expand on how important its neutrality and, I suppose, its decentralization is?
Yeah, definitely. And for this, I'll draw an analogy that I actually used on my episode yesterday, which is a collective memory. And this is a rabbit hole that goes way deep, but to kind of do it on the surface level, it's humans have organized in tribes all our existence, and for tribes of up to about 150 people, which is Dunbar's number, we could simply organize from collective memory as a tribe or a village, right? So there'd be a shared understanding of who's contributed what to the group, and who's created what value, and who's drawn from that pool of trust at times and has a debt that needs to be repaid. And this group of people, about 150 people, can operate with just this shared memory of this person's really trustworthy, right? Therefore, he has trust to spend on let me do a transaction for him. And in doing so, people know about it. I've gained trust. Now, everything we call civilization has just been ways to scale cooperation past 150 people, which is the limits of how many people we can know in our minds. And the thought process is, if you could have a perfect neutral, true, and everybody agreed it could be true and could verify it was true, right? If you could have such a perfect ledger of trust and transactions, similar to how villages worked and tribes worked for 8 billion people, then that would effectively be the perfect form of money, right? If you could have this sort of neutral, perfect ledger. And essentially what Bitcoin is as close to that as we can get in its design. And the neutrality is key, right? The neutrality, just the fact that doesn't matter if it's me or you using money, doesn't matter if it's US and Russia, US and Iran, right? You can see from events of this year that, Iran's waking up to the fact that all of its assets and mediums of exchange can be frozen except for its Bitcoin. The neutrality is key. When two parties transact, nobody should be able to come between those two parties, and manipulate the money. When two parties believe they are honestly, voluntarily transacting with consent, if there's a third party silently in the middle, that is fundamentally a source of dishonesty, right? Fundamentally a source of value leakage that is at the root of, all the phenomena that we talked about, the issues with debt-based money. And the neutrality, so you can see it in, we can observe the neutrality in Bitcoin's design in terms of how it's upheld by nodes around the world, how nodes have the say, how nodes essentially dictate the proof of work that miners perform, right? Miners perform proof of work with real-world energy, proving the work to nodes that are verifying. And that is the ultimate layer of why Bitcoin is by the people for the people, because nodes are cheap to run, and nodes are run by anonymous, decentralized group of human beings around the world. You, me, anybody can choose to run a node. They can choose not to be found. But what the node is doing is forming consensus with all the distributed tens of thousands of nodes around the world as to what is valid. And this keeps the system honest. Going back to, if we could have that perfectly honest, well, no individual can be trusted to maintain that. So how can we get there, right? It's something that we all have a say in, something that enough people understand the importance of this and uphold and underpin that honesty. And then to your point, the anonymity of the creator was also key for this to work, because if there was a known person, their very existence could either be a source of either way, right? Hero worship, where they could then be trusted to manipulate, or a head to cut off, right? A plane crash to stage, to borrow from the Banana Republic playbook. There is no such person. Again, people understood the nature of this problem, and part of the elegance of Bitcoin is that the creator understood how important it was that they remain unknown, and that there be this speculation, sure, but the fact is that privacy gives them power. And even to this day, right, the reason for Bitcoin's neutrality being a favorable option for, say, somebody to adopt, somebody to hold, somebody to invest in, right, allocate some percentage of their portfolio, or for a builder to build on, a foundation, right? It's ultimately a protocol at the end of the day with room for innovation on top through multiple layers, which is the other, way that is completely different than fiat or gold. But for a builder or an entrepreneur to come in and allocate, their gifts and seek to provide value in the future, seek to gain a return, the neutrality is key, because you'd rather build on something that's neutral than build on a foundation that somebody you don't know could arbitrarily manipulate.
You raise a good point. Just for the listener, you obviously mentioned Iran. For the listener that might not know, there was quite a lot of media headlines a couple of months ago when Iran shut the Strait of Hormuz as a result of their conflict with the US, and was apparently taking toll payments from shipping companies and even countries in Bitcoin to allow basically for safe passage. And that actually brings me on really nicely to, I guess, my next thought, Ricky, and to play devil's advocate, I suppose, just taking into consideration that one Iran example, I worked previously within a law firm, also within the real estate industry, incredibly smart people, but also very conservative, straight-laced, perhaps don't even hold gold in their ISA or their portfolio. And I guess the immediate reaction to someone talking about, the positive case for Bitcoin is that, it has criminal associations, for example, or it's a pure speculation play, it's a bubble, it's a Ponzi scheme. I guess, what would your response be to some of those criticisms?
Sure, I'll take the criminal one first, because the way I see things as of this moment on the criminal point is, my question would be, who are the criminals? Right? My question would be, who's telling you who the criminals are? And if you just observe the world around us, like, Is Iran the criminal? Is somebody making a social media post a criminal? Right? Very, very timely for you guys in the UK, right? Are gay people criminals? These are you have to ask these questions. For Canada, were the truckers that protested criminals, or were the people who donated to those people criminals? And look, in Vancouver, there's large circles of people who genuinely believe they were, right? But the point is, it's not about the particular group, it's about who gets to determine who criminals are. Because once a precedent is set in terms of the use of the Emergencies Act in our case, then, that power can be used. If it can be used against people that you don't like, that you genuinely think are criminals, then it can also be used against people that you think are righteous and free, right? And should have more rights. And that this is the nature of how power structures work. And again, I'm all just about like having transparent conversations, right? A lot of people, if they're stuck in like one camp or the other, let's say, it's what I would say to them is try to just shake them out of that, like try to have a conversation at a human level, right? At a level of like, okay, let's just observe some of these things about these camps and why the camps don't seem to be, either of them, on a path towards actually solving any of the problems that you actually do care about, right? So that's what I would say on the criminal side. And I completely agree. Like, this goes back to the disagreeable part, right? And the word disagreeable sounds like bad, but all it means is like, do you stand by what you, or stand by what you say when you actually disagree? And I think, we're at a point now where even before, and I would include myself in this group, it's like before, people who may have towed the line or been a goody two-shoes are now asking questions because the absurdities are becoming plain for all to see, right? The absurdities of somebody being arrested for a social media post, which is happening right now in your country, which is kind of crazy, right? And I experience this for myself when it's like when I'm in the UK and I see like ads that are saying, here's the list of countries that have banned VPNs. Could the UK be next? Like, the fact that these conversations are happening forces people to start waking up, right? And even if they don't wake up now, what we know about fiat is that it centralizes power, is that it has to keep imposing these types of impositions on rights and freedoms. And so even if somebody's still choosing to be a goody two-shoes now, down the line, right, they may sing a different tune depending on, and this is completely up to each individual's own choice. So that's what I would say on the criminals front. The answer is like, Bitcoin is money for enemies, right? Bitcoin is money for all human beings, whether it's a righteous person or a criminal. In fact, whether it's somebody without power to determine what the laws are or somebody with power. And the whole idea is that it's a level playing field amongst those people. Because right now, the fact that somebody is conditioning this person asking this question to think what a criminal is part of the problem, right? And then, what I would do is try to help people draw that understanding and make those connections in their minds if they're open to it. And generally speaking, I find, a matter of like patiently having this conversation and meeting somebody where they're at to be quite effective at helping them see exactly what the Bitcoin thesis is. And to your other question about if it's a scam or a Ponzi scheme, that's exactly the same approach. It's like, there's more to it, but are you open to, first of all, understanding it and going on this journey with me? If so, let's pursue like, whatever is the most interesting thread that I think can be pulled in that moment. Because actually, like, it's the same. It's just the same thing as like over time, people can't ignore the fact that this doesn't fit the hallmarks of a Ponzi scheme or a scam, right? It keeps going higher and higher. Every low, there's a crash, and then it keeps going way up, and people eventually have to face reality.
I mean, even just the length of time the network has been running is an immediate kind of rejection against that. You mentioned centralization of power. I know obviously one of the key pillars of the show as well is obviously artificial intelligence, and I kind of see Bitcoin and the changes of the monetary system very similar to obviously the technological changes that we're currently seeing from an AI perspective. Has your view changed at all in terms of when it comes to AI and its impacts? Certainly when it comes to kind of the role of work and the workforce itself.
Nope, no change. And the reason it hasn't changed, by the way, is because I lived through using AI to optimize my own business. Before I launched the show, there was about a 3-month period that I completely reorganized the way my business works around not just the current state of AI, but the trajectory of it. Right, equipping the people that I said that met a bar of AI nativeness potential. That this is exactly the shape of the upcoming trajectory. So even if it's not the current state, and even right now in early 2026, the current state is compared to before, when you would need a bunch of junior hires, right? The current state is far surpassed, and we can talk about the junior hires thing because that goes to what we observe day to day, right? But yeah, I know the AI transformation to be true because I've lived it. So you'll only observe some people at the helms of large corporations right now making statements of a similar type. Somebody like Jack Dorsey, right, who sees the same trajectory of how intelligence fundamentally reshapes work and is completely retooling their business, which is a publicly listed company, by the way, around that. And I would say he's on the frontier. And interesting that he's also really deep on understanding Bitcoin and the monetary side too. Very interesting to observe. But yeah, I speak with the conviction that I've gone through the journey, and I've said along the way there's going to be peaks and troughs. There's going to be narrative cycles, right? And these narrative cycles get amplified by the people leading the AI companies. So what narrative do they need? Do they need to talk about how AI is going to take 50% of jobs, or do they need to soften that at times for whatever purposes that we can't possibly know, right? Or do they need to say, oh my God, our AI models are too dangerous. We need to be protected and regulated. Or China's distilling us and that's completely illegal. This goes back to who makes the laws, right? Who has the power to cozy up to lawmakers? Who has the power funded by an infinite fiat machine? But yeah, going back to the AI thing, I think all we need to do is observe reality, right? And understand that we will kick the can down the road. And because of human inertia, we will choose to maintain and try to, protect a baseline for as long as we can. And this is true for every actor optimizing locally. And so what you're observing right now is simply, instead of putting a critical mass of people on the street that would threaten the viability of the whole system, we're just gonna, let the young generations kind of suffer, right? How many millennials and Gen Zs are jobless, have given up hope for searching for a job, which means they don't count as part of the unemployment rate anymore. Or they're simply relying on unstable gig work, which itself is being commoditized by, again, companies that are just pursuing their own missions, right? The emergence of AI, robotics, self-driving cars, and so on and so forth. So we're on this point where the current state cannot hold, but it can probably be held in perception for a bit longer. And if it can be, then we collectively will choose that comfort of it being held in that state, even if young people are suffering. But young people have little political power, right? So what do? They can complain, they can take on gig work, they can move back in with their families, and that can continue for a bit longer, right? But the technological force is still moving. The companies making rational optimizations on labor versus output is still a machine that keeps turning quarterly. So yeah, my take is, we keep moving, we'll keep seeing things that we observe, and I'll keep talking about it on the show. The whole point is this can be scary, but if we talk about it, we talk about why the transition leads us to a place of truth, hope, and abundance, right? And you have that understanding, then it doesn't have to be scary.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly won't we certainly won't go down the kind of abundance and I guess more Jeff Booth deflation rabbit hole. We'll save that for another day. I guess what I wanted to pick up on though is, I guess the one point that we do agree on is that we are seeing certainly younger people have a total rejection, one against the technology itself, but then also a more broader rejection of society as well. And one of the more dangerous results of that is that we are seeing this real, I guess, exaggerating the polarization that we're seeing of hard right and also of hard left. And I'm wondering, certainly within your mind, as a result of the failure to have that discussion, how dangerous really do you think that kind of dislocation that we are seeing from younger people particularly potentially is? And I guess in your mind, how do you kind of see that playing out?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, at the highest level, again, we're just in the same cycles, right? We've been here before, and before it would end one way, which is you get these polarized, gets more and more polarized. One party dominates the other, then you manufacture external enemies. And eventually that results in kinetic warfare, destruction of human capital. It's a terrible time for everybody involved. And this time we don't have to take those paths because there's a third path, which is adopting a form of money that obviates these problems, right? That ensures that there is a level playing field such that everybody can be on a trajectory to having their physical and psychological needs met. That puts a leash on inequality in the sense that, inequality isn't a structural byproduct of the system itself. Inequality can be the results of unequal value creation, which nobody would have a problem with because the value is created anyway, and it flows to the people using the money. And so if somebody in a Bitcoin world, right, creates more value and there's inequality as a result of there's a richer person because they've created more value, none of us would have a problem with that because it has been a level playing field. So then I look at left versus right and the underlying root causes, right? Forget the rhetoric, look past it. I would say to somebody, right, look at the underlying root causes. Somebody on the left wants to fix inequality, wants a level playing field. These are things that Bitcoin delivers. They want a cap on wealth. Now, they don't have the first clue. They may not have the first clue of what wealth is or where money comes from, but that's what they want. And what is there in Bitcoin? There's a fixed cap on the total amount of wealth, which, I think is a close enough parallel that I find that to be a useful, conversation thread sometimes. Now, on the right, then you've got what? You want to be rewarded for your agency, right? You want the free market mechanisms. And that's exactly what Bitcoin is too. It is the best of both worlds. And so what I see is, I don't see this, I see there being localized periods of conflict, right? Localized flashpoints and yeah, more and more of that if you're just paying attention to those things. But part of understanding Bitcoin at the deepest level is understanding that you choose what you pay attention to. Right, you choose what makes it into your sphere of attention, and ultimately your scarcest resource, which is your time and your attention. And so, if you're asking me what I see, all I see is this bright future becoming more and more known. Why? Because I'm seeing people tune into my show. Right, I'm seeing more and more people, whether it's on my show or in my day-to-day life. Now that I've started my show, see not just from me talking about these ideas, from me taking action. The truer state to myself that I'm in, and people want to at times, right, be a part of that. And sometimes they're like, okay, cool. Sometimes people are like, all right, this is a great conversation, let me go back to what I'm doing. But that's a seed that's been planted for the future. And so that's what I see and have chosen to see, if that makes sense. And this is an option available to any human being, which to me, when I think about this from a system dynamics point of view, I go back to I see the beauty in human beings and how resilient we are even in tough times, right? How even in the most dire of circumstances, there is hope and there is a desire for a better future, and especially for the next generation. And I don't think that force can be stopped.
I think people truly underestimate the power of economic empowerment and monetary empowerment as well. I mean, I can only speak from kind of my lived experience, but obviously finding Bitcoin and kind of doing the work and going on that journey, allowing me to step out of, what was a secure corporate job that I could have done for, the next 40 years of my life. However, as a result of, being economically and financially empowered meant that I had that optionality. I had that, I guess, breathing space that so many people, globally just don't have. And I think you're completely right in terms of saying actually there is a solution there. And it's almost hard to describe because to some extent you actually have to live it to really truly grasp how powerful it can be. I hope that people watching your show and anybody that would listen, potentially to this would take the steps to at least do the work and build that further understanding that, you've laid out so beautifully. I wanted to finish off on I hope you don't mind, but a slightly more personal question, Ricky. You spoke at the start of the show a little bit about how you were perhaps slightly disillusioned in terms of what you were doing before. You kind of, felt that kind of hedonistic lifestyle, I guess. In one of your videos you kind of spoke about the fact that you could have took first class flights for the rest of your life and that would have been a great career and people would have tuned in, and I'm sure people, as they did, would have got, great value from that content. And but that you did drift away from, I guess, those core reasons that made you start traveling in the first place. And when I first got into Bitcoin, so much of my time was spent on the more financial element of it and, that economic empowerment. But the longer the more time that passes, I begin to think more about the kind of more spiritual elements of it, it being a values-based, value for value system that you described earlier. But talking, going back to the point that you made around AI, and the fact that, potentially people could find themselves out of work, or be disillusioned even just at the thought of that potential displacement. I had a conversation the other day with another Bitcoiner who was actually religious. I'm not religious myself. I don't have a religious faith, but, I was talking to them about how I take great hope from, the future that we've spoken about, the fact that people can, have another potential option out there. Certainly from an economic freedom perspective, Bitcoin can provide that. However, I guess economic empowerment isn't the true, isn't the true end result to find meaning. I guess in your own mind, kind of in from your own perspective, but also for other people, where do you think we will find meaning from?
That's the ultimate question, isn't it? It's the ultimate question. Look, I completely agree. It can't be about the money. Okay. Just that simple is something I'll stand by, because Bitcoin is money and we have to understand the monetary transition, but it can't just be about the Bitcoin. In fact, when you get to a point of understanding what we're talking about here, where Bitcoin allows you to unlock your true self, then it kind of fades into the background, right? It becomes this form of money that, you're a steward of. It's your stored time and energy. It's your stored contributions and transactions on this collective global human ledger that we can all agree on, that's anchored by energy and unmanipulable. But that's all it is, right? And then it's like, what will you use that on? How will you spend your time? Look, I can give you the classic things like family and community, and then you've got, your personal characteristics and your upbringing and some of the experiences you've had, and those shape what you may find interesting to pursue from a place of flow state, right? I'm a big believer that work of the future will be from flow, not fear. right? Most work today, 9 to 5, is a fear-based work. Is if I don't go perform these tasks that have been arbitrarily handed to me, I will not be able to survive. That comes from a place of fear, full stop. Now, I've been very privileged to be able to experience, for most of my career, the opposite, like working from flow state. And I genuinely think that's what both of these twin transitions, AI and Bitcoin, technological and monetary, unlocks for billions of people. And it'll be uncomfortable at first. It'll be a transition, but to work from flow state is a real blessing, real privilege. And what emerges from that is going to be the meaning that's true to every individual person. And in fact, Lewis, I think one of the irreducibly scarce skills of the future that AI can't possibly replicate is that relational work of helping people understand what meaning is, right? Right now, I'm in the very early stages of crafting an answer. I know what's true for myself, and maybe I can do some of the first stages of helping somebody unlock it for themselves. But I think there's so much that's just unknown, and we don't possibly even have the language for it, because so few of us as human beings have been able to tap into that phase of self-actualization, right? What happens when billions of people start to get to that phase is something that, the same way that people from 100 years ago could never have even possibly conceived of something like Riverside or doing a podcast, we just can't conceive of. It's an emergent thing that we're on a path to unlocking. And as we get closer and closer to, I look forward to being able to update my answer. But yeah, that's what I've got for you right now.
I think that's a beautiful way of putting it, Ricky. There's so much anxiety, your shoulders feel so tight when you even think about a potential future where you're not given meaning as a result of a role that you have, a title, that you have, how many views, you get on YouTube for traveling the world. But I guess as a result of talking about it and having other people around you that aren't afraid to ask those questions and be honest in terms of also sharing their own feelings, be that excitement or anxiety, I wouldn't say that is the cure, but it's a step to the cure. And your show is so great in terms of that you can really see that evolution in thinking as a kind of a live process. And I would really encourage more people, whether it's publicly or privately, to try and share their feelings, be that in a conversation with another person or perhaps keeping a journal or whatever. But it's only in communicating and sharing those feelings that you can even begin to try and understand them.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. It goes back to me for a journey that we're all on together. 8 billion people, and I'm bullish on 8 billion people. And it's on the technology side, it's on the monetary side, and it's on the meaning side, right? On the underlying level, that's what it's all about. And daunting but exciting is very much accurate.
Don't want to open up another rabbit hole, but is there a further message that you would share?
Yeah, I guess I would just reinforce the urgency. I do the show daily because my mind, it's important and urgent, right? It matters greatly, and it matters greatly right now. And I think today, the episode I'm doing is from a chat that somebody left yesterday, is like, could this possibly happen too fast? Or what's the pace going to be? And I don't think so. I think it needs to happen as fast as possible. And I think we all need to do our part. And I think, mass problem awareness comes from conversations, whether it's at scale through YouTube or one-to-one, right? Within your circles, within people you care about. But yeah, I just invite people to it's tempting to, it's just so easy to not challenge your priors, right? Not do some of the tough work of having to question your old beliefs. But this is one of those times, like many times in history, that calls for us to do so. And, those who move early will see the value from having been part of the transition. And yeah, just leave it on that note of this matters and this matters now.
Thank you, Ricky. And where can people find your show?
Age of Abundance, the show. You can just search Age of Abundance on YouTube. Daily at weekdays, 10 a.m. Pacific time, 1 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. UK. Okay, so And then I've built a clip machine that posts onto X so people can tune into the best parts. Sometimes I'm active there, but mostly on YouTube and building out the show from here. And future episodes and updates will come from that.
It's been my daily running soundtrack for the last month or so. So I really look forward to the future episodes, Ricky. Just thanks again for your time and sharing your insights with you. And I just encourage everyone to check out Age of Abundance and I guess kind of join us on this journey.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you to everybody, and congrats to you, Lewis, for launching Orientation. Right, this is a big step for you as well. You've done your writings, now you're showing up on camera, so you're a living proof of what we've been talking about.
Thank you, Ricky. I appreciate that.